here, right? We ask for what we need. As Rafia said, I'm the Director of Tennesseans for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, and several years ago now, as Rafia came on board and as we had been talking about really the Victims' Compensation Fund here in Tennessee and the struggles that we felt folks were having with it, we decided, you know what, we need to broaden our scope here, and we need to think about how do we support victims of violent crime, how do we work to prevent violent crime in the first place, all of which, if we were doing more of that, would lessen the desire that people may have for the death penalty. What we know about the death penalty is that the vast majority of people sitting on Tennessee's death row right now were victims of violence first. And they were victims of violence that their trauma was never addressed. And they tragically acted out of that violence at some point along the way with terrible consequences. And so we feel very privileged to be on this journey with Rafia, with Mothers Over Murder, with Rodney's Village, and with all of you. I know I've learned a tremendous amount from your stories, from your amazing work in the community. And we want to continue that learning process as we move forward together. One of the things that we have grave concerns about, and I think Aswad's going to talk probably more about this, is the extraordinary amount of resources that we as a state spend on excessive punishments when we have so many needs in our communities that are not being met. And the death penalty is sort of the penultimate, if you will, of those punishments. It impacts very few people, and we spend millions more pursuing the death penalty than we would for alternative sentencing. We put families through decades of litigation, and sadly, because we know so many innocent people continue to be sentenced to death for things they didn't do, it's necessary that litigation go on for a long time. But that's money, millions of dollars we're spending to execute people 30 to 40 years after a crime has occurred who were already incarcerated. Right? How is that addressing our needs now? How is that preventing the next violent crime tomorrow? Right? We think we have got to be smarter about this and put the focus and the investment on where it needs to be, which is supporting people who are harmed, walking with them toward healing, and working to prevent violence in our communities in the first place. So I just wanted to sort of explain how our organization has grown into this work and continues to grow into this work. I know I just want to mention this because we're all on the journey, right? And there are people in this room for whom the death penalty is not something that it's their priority, right? Or it's something that they're on the fence about, or maybe something they fully support. I don't know, and that's fine, because this is a space for all of us, right? However, some of you may be to a point in your journey where you're ready to say, you know what, we don't need this. It's not serving us. It's taking our eye off what we need to focus on, which is preventing harm and supporting people who've been harmed. That's where the priority needs to be. If you're there and you want to consider signing a letter that Rafia put together, we have people in this room, Tim Williams and others, who were part of a press conference back in 2025 that asked Governor Lee, you know what, Governor, rather than spending millions of dollars to pursue the execution of 40 people who've been in prison for 30 years, what if we were doing something with that money right now, pouring it into victims' compensation, pouring it into our communities who need mental health care, kids who need programs to be a part of? What if we were doing that instead, right? It's not really talking about whether we should or shouldn't have a death penalty. It's just what do we need and what makes the biggest difference, right? So if you're interested in that, there is a framed letter on the table here as you come in that has a QR code, and you can look at that letter and possibly consider whether you want to put your name on that. So again, thank you all so much for being here. I know we're all waiting for our keynote speaker, who has traveled a long way to be with us, and we are so thrilled to have Aswad Thomas with us. And He spoke earlier this morning. You can see that he is the vice president of Just Safe, which was formerly Alliance for Safety and Justice. He is the national director of its flagship project, Crime Survivors Speak. He himself, as he said earlier, is a survivor of violence. He is a leader in this nation.
Why we are here in Tennessee, when Jeremy was presenting about the Victim Compensation Program, I probably got a bill already, right, or some of the improvements we need to continue to make. So I'll talk about what that could look like for us here in Tennessee, but most important, how do we build political power, right, by organizing survivors as the key constituency that should be driving public safety policy. Right, so it's been an honor. To my first time here in Jackson, Tennessee. I was actually just in Jackson, thank you. I was just in Jackson, Mississippi 2 weeks ago, because we were also doing a lot of work out there, and it's always just amazing to be surrounded by so many people who have taken, their pain, right, and turned it into our purpose. And so to everyone that's here, to all the families, all the mothers, the fathers, the brothers, the sisters, the friends, I see you. And I know that it's not easy, as we talked about earlier today. It's a lifelong process, right, when you experience harm or when you lose a loved one. But as Rafia mentioned, like, heal people, right? I know I got a lot of healing today just by being in this space with you. Also, Rafia, I really want to acknowledge your vision, your leadership, and also, you've made this campaign possible, right? So I just want to thank you so much for being just an amazing individual, always caring about others more than you care about yourself. So just thank you so much. And I know you all, Tim, I know you all have been going across the state, and what you have built here is more than an event, right? This is an opportunity, to continue to build a movement, which I think y'all were intentional about going across the state of Tennessee to have these type of conversations. And, because at the core of movements are people, right? And are people who look just like us, people who have survived violence or lost loved ones to violence, but we also have to recognize that many of us did not get any support after losing a loved one or becoming a victim of violence ourselves. And for me, years ago, as I mentioned earlier, I was one of those individuals. So I don't come from the nonprofit setting. I don't come from policy. I'm a former basketball player. As the youngest of 5 boys, I was surrounded by a lot of poverty. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. I spent a lot of my childhood in Hartford, Connecticut. So grew up in 2 communities rooted by poverty, rooted by a lot of violence. And I've also lost a lot of friends to violence as well. I've lost over 40 friends to violence throughout my life. And despite losing so many friends, I never imagined that I, myself, would become a victim. So in 2009, I had just graduated from college. I was the first male in my family to ever graduate from college. Thank you. And that moment was huge for me, but it was huge for my family. It was huge for my community. Because growing up, I didn't know any black man that ever went to college, let alone graduated from college. So that was like the highest point of my life, right? Graduated from college. I was also a star college basketball player as well. My nickname, if you follow basketball, my nickname is, I'm known as the Black Steve Nash. Right? So that's my nickname. So I was very good on a basketball court. After I graduated, I signed with a professional agent to start my professional basketball career overseas. And so for me, that year 2009, I graduated from college and now was, about to embark on my professional basketball career. And you couldn't tell me nothing at that time, right? I was just on this all-time high because 2 things that I worked so hard for, and we all want our kids, right, to be successful, to go to school and to accomplish their dreams, and I was able to do that. But unfortunately, on that night of August 24th, 2009, everything changed for me. While leaving a corner store in my neighborhood in Hartford, Connecticut, I was shot twice in my back. And that incident ended my professional basketball career, and it nearly ended my life as well. And I remember kind of waking up in the hospital, and I remember my doctors, coming over to my bedside and say, Mr. Thomas, you suffer from 2 gunshot wounds. Both of these bullets are close to your spinal cord, just inches away from your aorta, and we don't know if you're going to walk again. Right? When I heard that, yeah, thank God, right, walking again, right? When I heard that, my first thought wasn't about walking again. My first thought was, well, I better play basketball again. Right? In those moments, in the hospital, those lonely nights, right? When my mom has to leave the visiting room, it's just you sitting up in that hospital room, dealing with so much pain, dealing with this kind of this new normal that you have to go through. And I remember being discharged from the hospital about a few weeks later, and my doctors and my nurses, they were telling me about all the physical challenges that I would have recovered from the shooting, but they never mentioned the psychological effects, the mental toll. They never talked about the flashbacks that I would be having, about the nightmares, those deep stages of depression, the stress, the panic attacks. So they never prepared me for the other side of harm, which is dealing with the psychological effects of being a victim. And so I was released from that hospital back into the same neighborhood where I was shot. Right, so just think about this, right? Being released after becoming a victim back into the same neighborhood where you was shot, and also not knowing who shot me as well. Right, so not only was I dealing with the physical pain, the psychological pain, but also this deep fear of not knowing who shot me. Right, and it was that fear that kind of changed my life. And it was that fear of knowing and learning about who had shot me. So in my situation, there were 2 teenagers involved in my shooting. These 2 teenagers, there was 18 years old and 19 years old at that time. And about a year and a half after that shooting, the 19-year-old was arrested for his role in that shooting. And I remember the first day of trial, going to the courtroom. I used to watch a lot of Law and Order, when I was younger, right? So I was nervous, but I was, kind of prepared for kind of like trial. And I remember, kind of before, my prosecutor and detectives taking me upstairs so I could testify, right? And for the first time, seeing someone, right this close to me, of someone who ended my basketball career. Right, seeing someone who nearly ended my life. And that was a scary feeling. Right, and I remember asking the prosecutor, I said, hey, if I testify, this person get found guilty, how much time would he be facing? And it said, Mr. Thomas, he's 19 years old, he's known to us, he's known to law enforcement, he's been arrested several times. With the evidence that we have in the case, with your testimony, we're confident he's going to be found guilty. And we're confident that he's going to spend the next 40 years in prison. I was like, whoa. I said, he's 19 years old at the time, and if he's found guilty, he's going to spend 40 years in prison. And something just like came over me at that moment of thinking about spending the next 40 years in prison. And then I thought about my oldest brother. So my oldest brother, he's serving life without a possibility of parole. And I thought about the experience that my family was going through of having a loved one incarcerated for the rest of their lives, right? And I didn't know if I wanted that 19-year-old to go through what my mother was going through, what our family was going through, how broken our family has been since my older brother been incarcerated. And I remember asking, kind of detectives, like, can you all tell me about this 19-year-old? They said, well, Ms. Thomas, he's known to law enforcement. He's so different from you, right? Look at you. You're a college graduate. He never made it out of high school, right? He could barely read or write. And the more kind of thing that they were sharing about this young man, I thought to myself, like, how are we so different? Right? We both grew up in the same neighborhood. The only thing that I thought that we were different was maybe I was just a better basketball player. Where I had better opportunities in life because of my basketball skills. I had parents, I had coaches that poured hours and hours into me. Right? That was the only way that I thought we were so different. Right? So as I'm kind of like processing all of this information, my prosecutor said, "Hey, Mr. Thomas, the judge is calling us. We got to get upstairs." And I was just like nervous. I said, I'm about to play a role in this 19-year-old potentially being found guilty and spending 4 years in prison. And then something kind of clicked in me once again. I used to watch a lot of Law and Order, right? So something said, plea deal, right? So if you watch a lot of Law and Order, right, most of the cases, actually it's like plea bar, there's a plea deal, right? So I asked him, I said, hey, have you offered him a plea deal? And he said, yes, we offered him a plea deal twice, and he declined both offers. Right, and I'm saying, can y'all just ask him one more time? Before I go upstairs, please do this for me one more time. And so they left, they came back about 5 minutes later, and they said, Mr. Thomas, he accepted the plea deal. So you won't have to testify today in this plea deal. He will be sentenced to 6 to 10 years in prison for his role in my shooting. Right? And for me, that felt good for me. One, I knew that I was going to have my accountability as a victim, right? We want accountability, we want justice, right? Also, I was thinking about having faith in the justice system that, he spent 10 years in prison, he's going to be rehabilitated, be able to come home before he's 30 years old, get a job, have kids, be a productive member in society, right? And that was the outcome that I wanted for that young man. So I remember leaving that, I felt good about that sentence, right? So that was the 19-year-old, right? And then there was the other person, the 18-year-old that was involved in my shooting. The 18-year-old was never arrested in my case. And I remember during my last doctor's appointment, because when I got shot, these bullets were close to my spinal cord, so they couldn't remove the bullets for years. So I had to go to a lot of, appointments, a lot of doctor's appointments, and kind of, a lot of x-rays, right? And at a point in time, they was able to kind of, set up a point for me to remove these bullets out of my back. And as I'm on an operating table, my doctor, as he's performing surgery on me, I was conscious, I could hear everything. I couldn't feel anything, right? But I was aware of what was going on. And my doctor, as he's performing the surgery to remove the bullets out of my back, I remember him saying, Aswad, you remind me of someone. He said, you remind me of this 14-year-old that had came into the hospital about 4 years before I was shot. This 14-year-old had came to the hospital. He was shot. He was from my neighborhood. He was shot. He was shot in his eye. And as a result of that shooting, that 14-year-old had lost sight in his eye. And as my doctor was sharing these details, for some reason, like my heart was like beating fast, like I was having a panic attack, listening to another story of someone who's just like me, right, being a victim and having to go through the trauma, right? And the more details my doctor was describing, I had a flashback. I had a flashback to that night when I was shot, and I realized that my doctor was describing the 18-year-old that shot me. Right, and I knew that from his physical characteristics, right, the patch that he had on his eye, right, and I just flashed back that night, and I say, Dr. Marshall, can you pause the surgery because I have to tell you something. You just described the second teenager that shot me that never got arrested. And I remember my doctor, he stopped the surgery, and he said, I'm a curse, he said, get the fuck out of here. Just like that. He said, we did the same thing to him at 14, what we did to you. We saved his life. We discharged him out of that hospital, back into that same neighborhood with no help, no support. Right? And so I couldn't imagine as a 14-year-old of being a victim of gun violence, once again, having to live in that same community, right? having a disability because he can't see out of one eye, and all of the trauma that he was going through for years, right? And I strongly believe a lot of that unaddressed trauma that he was going through, that played a huge role in my shooting years later, right? And it was right there, I said, you know what? I want to do something about that cycle of violence, right? Because that teenager, those two teenagers, we failed them. The justice system failed them, society failed them, and our public safety system that's designed to help people failed them as well, right? And so as I'm kind of, starting to recover and process, about these two individuals that shot me, I was still kind of dealing with the effects of being a victim, right? And dealing with all of this trauma. And so I went back to school. I went back to school to get my master's in social work. My social workers in the room, right? Social workers unite. Right, I got my master's in social work because I wanted to really learn the impact of trauma and how trauma impacts our lives, how it impacts families, and also how it impacts communities as well. So I went back to school, got my master's degree in social work, and then I got this amazing opportunity to join our organization, which is Crime Survivors Speak, right? And for me, that moment of joining this organization, and ironically, the first day of joining Crime Survivors Speak back in 2015 was on the 6-year anniversary of my shooting. Right, so this day that I've always been such a negative day for me, those anniversaries, y'all, are tough, right, for many of us. And I never liked that day, but now 6 years later, as I was going on my first day of my job, was on the anniversary of my shooting. That's why everything came full circle for me. That God said, Aswad, you may have been good in basketball, but I got something else in store for you. And I'm gonna close this basketball chapter in your life, and I'm opening up this new chapter for you to be a voice, to be an advocate for survivors, right? And so at Crime Survivors Speak, I spend a lot of my time, and Rafia and folks who know me know this, I spend a lot of my time on the road. I spend a lot of my times going state by state, in these type of conversations that we're having today, meeting with parents, in those living rooms, sometimes going to the morgue with parents, meeting with victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. And the main thing I'm doing, as I've been doing today, is listening. Right? Listening to the stories and experience of survivors, listening to, the survivors who was never made aware of the state's victim compensation program. Right? Listening to the survivors who were denied access to the state's victim compensation program because of the policies that are in place. Right? As Jeremy talked about today, there's these time limits that exist all across the country, and every state is different. Right? So in the state of Alabama, in order to be eligible for the victim compensation program, you got to file a police report within 48 hours of a crime from happening. Right? So that used to be Tennessee, right? You got to file a police report within 48 hours of being a victim. Right? The majority of crime goes unreported. Right? Majority of victims of sexual assault or domestic violence, they don't report to their loved one, to their family, to their kids, to their friends, right? So these 48 hours, these time limits in order to report. Also across the country, there's these time limits in, that you have time to file a claim, right? In Alabama, it was 1 year. Tennessee, it was 1 year, right? In several states, it's like the time limit for victims to file a claim for victim compensation. So like these reported time limit barriers, right? And also, what we talked about today is these barriers that also exist where the state deemed that someone contributed to their own victimization, right? And Nina pointed out how many compensation programs, they just rely on that police report, right? And I've met so many people who've been denied access to the victim compensation program because they get that denial letter in the mail that says you've been denied victim compensation because your claimant, your son contributed to their own victimization. right? And that contributes to their own victimization. Often is the police officer write up a police report and says that this person was involved in the gang, right? Or this person, like in Mississippi, this person had weed in their system at the time of the crime, so they contribute to their own victimization, right? So these policies that deem people contribute to their own victimization, so claims are being denied at high rates. Also, there's other policies that in order for you to be eligible for victim compensation, you have to cooperate with law enforcement. And that cooperation is often throughout the entire process, right? You have to cooperate with law enforcement, right? And also, I've been doing this work for almost, more than 10 years now. And I think all of us are aware of the racism and the racial disparities that exist in the criminal justice system, right? How many people know that there are racial disparities that exist in who's being incarcerated in this country, right? It's a majority of black men and black women who are incarcerated, right? But I'm gonna go a level deeper for you all. I think there's more racism and more racial disparities in victim services about who actually gets help. Often it's based on your zip code, it's based on how you look, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And these are the issues, right, that Crimes for Our Speak is working to address. And we're not working to address these issues by just sharing our stories, right? We believe in the power of sharing our stories for sure, right? Because it helps us heal, right? It helps others, right? But we also want to share stories that change policies and impact budgets, right? We want to tell our stories to change hearts and minds. So at Crimes for Our Speak, the three things that we mainly do, and I'm excited to be building this work right here in Tennessee, is that we build community all across the country, right? Bringing survivors together to provide that peer-to-peer support, right? Bringing survivors together, to support each other, right? Because the justice system is not supporting us, right? All the victim service agencies that's getting the millions of dollars, they're not supporting us. Right, what we heard today was I'm getting support from my niece, my nephews, my aunts, my cousins, my friends and families. Those are the support that many of us get. So we work on really building community through our chapters, provide that peer-to-peer support. Our chapters host different meetings and events all throughout the year. So it's really big on building community, bringing survivors together as a community, right? Then the second thing that we do is we build skills, because we believe in providing survivors with the skills and the knowledge that they need to become organizers, right? With the skills and knowledge that they need to become advocates, right? With the skills and knowledge that they need to be able to talk to the media, right? So we are big on leadership development of training the next generation of leaders in this country that are survivors. Yes. Right, so leadership development, building skills is the second thing that we do all across this country. And then the third thing that we do is we build political power. We build political power by organizing survivors state by state that are trained, that are educated, right, that are able to go to their state capital, not just one of us, not just 5 of us, but we bring hundreds of survivors to a state capital in the states that we work in. Right, and many of you went to the Washington, D.C. in 2024. We brought thousands of people from all across the country to our nation's capital to advocate for a right to heal. Right, so our work isn't about providing direct services. We advocate for more funding to those community-based organizations to provide those direct services, right? And we also provide, through our member support program, access to counseling, things like BetterHelp, right? So just by being a member of Crimes for Our Speak, you get access up to 3 months of free therapy just by being a member of Crimes for Our Speak, right? But we are an organization that wants to build power, run campaigns, and change policies and laws, right? And we've been doing that all across the country. So since our founding, we've passed over 110 public safety reforms and bills all across this country. We are the leading organization that has been changing the victim compensation programs state by state. We've changed victim compensation programs in 14 states and counting. right? So when we first met Rafia in Tennessee, right? Tennessee was 48 hours, right? It was that 1 year time limit, right? We partnered with Rafia and others, right? And provided a lot of research, a lot of policy expertise, and now we've made changes to this state's compensation program. That was just one change, y'all. There's a lot more changes we need to make, right? So we passed a lot of victim compensation laws. We also been working on really building the infrastructure of healing and well-being and victim services in communities, right? And once again, I traveled this entire country, right? In the next 3 days, I'll be in 5 states in the next 3 days, right? And so a lot of my traveling, the one thing that I've noticed, and I'm curious to hear from you all of what this looks like in Memphis or Nashville or here in Jackson, but most communities that I go through do not have an infrastructure of healing and victim services in those communities. Most people do not have a place to go to get access to comprehensive wraparound services to help people who are dealing with crime and violence every single day. Right? Most people do not have a place to go to in their neighborhood. Right? When I was a victim of gun violence, in order for me to get access to victim services, I would have had to take 2 buses, public transportation, right, while I'm recovering from the shooting, in order to get victim service from the next town over. Right? And so what we are building all across this country, and Cynthia mentioned it earlier, is that we need to build more trauma recovery centers. Right? So trauma recovery centers, it's a new model that we've been developing all across the country. We started with 1 in California. Now we have 57 trauma recovery centers all across the country. And it's really about building a place, a physical place in the community where all survivors can go to get access to support and help without all of the red tape. Right? In order for you to get support from the DA's office, the prosecutor's office, you gotta cooperate. In order for you to get